Right.
So welcome everyone. I have Marcos Patchett here. He's the author of the super incredible, amazing book called The Secret Life of Chocolate, which is 20 plus years of research about cacao, about the history. Um, this book is so packed, and honestly, I have not read all of it. But I've read enough of it to have some questions and talk with Marcos today. Thank you so much for joining, Marcos.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to check my audio, Andrew, because I think I'm hearing you. I'm not hearing you through my headphones. I'm hearing you through my computer audio.
So what you can do is you see the mute button, and there should be an arrow button just on that button.
I see.
Click,
All right.
click that arrow button, and then on speaker, it should be like headset or something, and see if that works.
Ah, okay. All right. Yeah. There we go. Okay. That should work.
Check.
Yes. Great. Okay. Cool. All right. So,
Yeah.
fire away, Andrew.
Cool. So me and Marcos, I was trying to hope to get a little conversations and connecting with Marcos before we jumped in, but Marcos was just super excited about, like, all right, how do I get your Instagram? Let's start. I was like, cool, let's do this then.
Yeah.
So just real quick, Marcos, I just want to check in on time. How much time are you able to tune in with? Do you have a time limit, or are you just open to riff?
No, hour and a half, but whatever. That an hour and a half would probably be my top, just because I have a few jobs to do later on. But yeah, let's say that.
Cool, beautiful. Sweet. So, Marcos, if you could please give us a little rundown of your story. What inspired you to write this book?
Okay. Well, I'm a herbalist. Go all the way back to the beginning. I was an art student in London, and I didn't really, and then I sort of got into herbal medicine. And I started, I talk a bit about this in the introduction to the book. When I was in my late teens and I was sort of going out partying too much, I would come back in from partying, and my post-partying recovery meal would always be bananas and dark chocolate. Just ordinary, like, dark chocolate you buy from the shop, but like a melted dark chocolate, bananas, whatever.
Yeah.
And then I've always been a bit of a chocoholic, so it was kind of, and I've always been interested in finding the most original, like the old school form of something, because I always operate from the assumption that if something was done a certain way traditionally, there's probably a good reason for that. Now, it doesn't mean that everything traditional is correct, but it does mean that there's usually, like, there's a good reason, like bread was made a certain way, or like those traditional processes evolved over millennia. And I think particularly in the 20th century, there's a tendency for us to kind of reinvent the wheel all the time. Like, oh, we can do this better. We can do it cheaper. We can do it faster. We can do it mass production. We can, there's all these. And sometimes that reinvention produces amazing new products. And sometimes what it really does is it degrades the quality of the old product. So particularly with plants and foods, I always assume that the traditional method is probably superior, just because it's like homemade and whatever. Anyway, so my was using cacao and sort of like post-party recovery a little bit, started studying herbal medicine, became more interested in what the pharmacology of cacao was about. And it was sort of during that degree in the early 2000s that I conceived the idea of writing the book. And I really had several priorities for the book. I sometimes describe it as like it's a series of Trojan horses made of chocolate, like Russian dolls, like one inside the other, where you've got the outer thing is what's its pharmacology, its history, its mythology. And then inside that, you've got the idea of sort of natural products medicine and plant medicine. And where does that come from? How does it differ from the sort of pharmacological medicine and that sort of thing? And then inside that, you've got sort of magical thinking, really. And what is it? And like when I'm talking about magical thinking, I'm talking about animism and traditional ways of looking at the world, which were sort of over the past 200 years post-Enlightenment. We've sort of, obviously in the West, we've developed this assumes that I use this quote a lot from one of the Star Wars prequel films, you know, when he's looking for the thing in the library and it's not on the system, and the librarian gets really annoyed with him and says, if it is not on our system, it does not exist. And I think that a lot of our 20th century scientific thinking is like that. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, it's fully that. So it's not, because I'm come from an arts background and then did a science degree, I've kind of got, I have think the scientific methodology of like pulling things apart and seeing how they work and testing those things empirically is really important. But I also think that the traditional sort of more magical ways of thinking and seeing the world are also important, partly psychologically, just because of the meaning they give things, but also partly because I think that's how we actually experience the world, you know, in terms of what we feel about things and how they feel to us and the meanings we put on them and all that kind of stuff. So there was a book that really inspired me. I mean, there's been loads of books that really inspired me, but particularly for Cacao, and that was Jonathan Ott's book called Chocolate Addict. Jonathan Ott, you're probably familiar with him. He's an ethnobotanist, pharmacologist. He wrote his biggest book, I think, is Pharmacotheon, which is a really brilliant big study of psychoactive plants, like and some substances like DMT and stuff like that. But he also wrote this little book in the 80s called Chocolate. And really inspired me. But there were also things in that book that I instinctively thought were probably wrong. Like he said that all the psychoactivity of cacao was due to theobromine, and I was just like, no, that seems wrong just from the off, because it's like if you compare cacao to coffee, to tea, to guarana, to mate, to other caffeine or xanthine containing plants, they're all quite, yes, they're all stimulants, and there's a lot of overlap, but there's very distinct attributes to those plants in terms of how they make you feel. Just due to the different doses of caffeine and theobromine in the plants. So anyway, so that's a bit of background.
That's beautiful, man. I was actually researching that book by John, Chocolate Addict, and I couldn't find how to get my hands on a book. So I'm totally curious how you did that, and if there's a possible way for me to get my hands on one too.
That it was mainly because, Andrew, I purchased my copy around 20 years ago.
So, valid.
Then, I mean, I got my copy. I got it around 2000, and even then it was difficult to find because I got a second-hand copy or whatever. So, but just hunt around. It's a bit like a truffle hunt. You'll find one eventually. You know, it's just looking in little back alleys of the internet and used bookstores and stuff. But I'm very lucky to have that because as I say, that it was hard to find 20 years ago. So yeah.
So I know you mentioned and talking about DMT, and I've actually heard, and I think I've actually done some research that supposedly there's actually DMT in cacao, or excuse me, that ingesting cacao, it actually can release DMT in the brain. Have you done any research or found out, or if this is valid at all?
Oh. Okay, the connection on the Zoom is really bad, Andrew. So I know but you're saying about it. Does cacao release DMT?
Exactly.
Okay. Right. So the bottom line to that is I cannot answer that with certainty. I would think not, but I don't want to say 100% not. And the reason I say that is because, you know, from the research that I've done, but there's new research coming along all the freaking time. So it's plausible. I think from the research, because obviously, you know, from the back of the book, there's a whole.
Yeah.
All right, so I think the bottom line is it probably doesn't, and that's because I don't know of any pharmaceutical compounds in cacao that would directly release DMT. Cacao does contain this whole term for them because they're really low levels of constituents which can have interesting effects on various different compounds. So there's tiny low levels of serotonin and phenethylamine and anandamide. Anandamide, the brain's cannabinoid, amphetamine type, happy neurochemical. These other little trace compounds like the alkaloid salsolinol, which increases dopamine turnover in some parts of the brain. It's produced in fermentation. You've got what else with the phenethylamine? There's also trigonelline, which is also found in coffee, incidentally, which increases the uptake of phenethylamine into the brain. And I think possibly most importantly, the polyphenols themselves, the antioxidants themselves, have some monoamine oxidase inhibitory activity. So they'll slow down the breakdown of serotonin and dopamine and phenethylamine. So one of my hypotheses in the book is cacao, while it is not in and of itself a particularly potent psychoactive in a sense, it's actually what I call a hedonic modifier. I think it lubricates the pleasure circuitry of the brain in all kinds of different directions, such that it can potentiate endorphin responses or opiate responses, such that it can potentiate trace amine responses like serotonin and dopamine and phenethylamine, and such that it can possibly potentiate also cannabinoid responses. And the polyphenols, the antioxidants, play a big role in that too, because we know that a lot of them increase the release of nitric oxide, which, apart from being a vasodilator and improving blood flow everywhere, also in the brain has a sort of modulatory effect on opiate release, such that if you have low background endorphins, the nitric oxide will amplify their effect or increase their release. And if you have very high endorphins, it'll shut them down a bit. So in terms of DMT specifically, I think it might be reasonable to assume that cacao might be a mild DMT potentiator in the same way that it seems to be mildly for psilocybin from the mushrooms, which are of course consumed alongside cacao. We know from certainly the Aztecs, the Mexica, drank cacao at feasts and then consumed the mushrooms. So yeah, I'm just going to check the microphone, Andrew, because I don't think I can hear you again. Speakers, microphone. Yeah, I should be able to hear you. So
Check.
okay, good. Yeah,
Cool.
I can hear you. That's great. So yeah, to the DMT, the answer is I'm not sure. I don't think, from what I've found, cacao releases DMT directly. However, I do think it's very plausible that it will potentiate DMT just as it potentiates other tryptamines. Not strongly, but enough just to level them up by 25% or something like that.
That's really interesting that you say that, because when you're talking, I'm considering my own personal experience. And when I'm talking about my own personal experience, I'm referring to like doing cacao and then doing breath work. And then
Right.
after the breath work session, I'm totally seeing things 100%.
Third eye wide open kind of thing.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm totally seeing something, like, and I had to like try to explain this to my friends, like, guys, I saw this like tribal looking deity entity like right here. And then I think later I found out that I had heard that DMT is released drinking cacao. And then I was trying to do some research and I found something in a book that it had said something like that. It had mentioned that, but researching and really looking for, scientific evidence,
Yeah.
I mean,
there isn't, I don't think there is any yet.
Yeah.
That is the case. It's an interesting hypothesis, but I certainly think it's likely to, well, I think it's likely, not going to say certainly, I think it's likely that it will potentiate the DMT in the brain. And absolutely, when I drink cacao, I love to meditate after I've had cacao, because it just, you go so much deeper. And any form of breath work or visualization, not so much visualization actually, but just definitely the breath work and the effect it has on you. And I think that's because you get that vasodilation and that combo of it amplifying all the little neurotransmitters. So yeah.
I mean, as you probably know, I mean, from my research, cacao is perhaps the most, it has the most constituents to it. And my understanding is it may not even be fully understood and fully discovered.
Okay, I would agree with that. I mean, look, I'm not going to say that it has the most constituents to it, because I think as a herbalist, I've got to put a word in for every other medicinal plant. Most medicinal plants are just like, they're kind of amazing. Like, plants are the original pharmacists, right? And your average medicinal plant, like say chamomile or yarrow or peppermint, synthesizes freaking hundreds or thousands of compounds.
Wow.
What used to be called secondary metabolites, like in the sort of materialist, they were, oh, these are waste products. We now know that that's completely wrong, because in terms of the energy expenditure for the plant, often manufacturing these so-called secondary metabolites costs the plant more energy than not manufacturing them at all. So some of them, of course, the theory is that the plants produce these compounds for defensive purposes, you know, to stop them being eaten by pests or attacked by fungi or bacteria. In some cases, that's absolutely true. And in other cases, we just don't know why they produce them from a materialist standpoint. Like, why would a plant produce tons of DMT, for example? Except if you start looking at it from a more animistic, shamanic / holistic perspective, like, you can look at it from a reductionist perspective still, if you use a sort of ecosystem model. If you think about, these plants have grown up and evolved alongside other animals, including humans. So maybe some of these plants have evolved to be used by humans, to be of use. I mean, that's a bit of a wild theory, but certainly from a shamanic perspective or an animist perspective, the idea that a plant might have a kind of consciousness, which is totally wacky from a modern perspective, but it would kind of fit with that. But yeah, I think cacao certainly has loads of constituents in. I've tried to do in the tables at the back of the book, as every compound I could find, I put in that table and tried to measure it and, you know, put all the little details in about it. But you know, it's what, as the fishing lines get more sophisticated, the new chemicals will keep getting pulled out, and old compounds that may have been once thought to be inert, they'll find new receptors, or they'll do new things. Like, for example, there's this whole class of compounds you find in cacao, and you find similar compounds, not the same though, but similar in coffee and some other roasted seed products, called diketopiperazines, that are produced when you roast or toast the beans. It's like they're made from proteins, amino acids, and they're like little combinations of like 3 or more amino acids, and they cross the blood-brain barrier. So we know they get into the brain. And when these have been individually you know, investigated, some of them are found to have anti-cancer properties, some of them are found to have neuroprotective or nerve cell protective properties, some of them affect cells in the immune system. A bunch of them, there are loads of them in cacao. There's a whole raft of them, and we don't know what any of them do. We know they get into the brain. So you know what I mean? It's there's loads of stuff still to be discovered, 100%. So
yeah, this is really interesting, because now I'm considering about how the indigenous people had this innate knowing, first off, of how to even prepare the cacao, to ferment the beans for a certain amount of days, to sun dry it, and then to toast it, and then to grind it up so fine that it turns it into like a chocolate syrup, and then it solidifies. So
yeah, there's two. I mean, there's two sort of schools of thought there, I guess, aren't there? I mean, one, the standard sort of evolutionary theory, kind of 20th century materialist model, yada yada, which I don't want to say that I'm down on. I just want to emphasize that it is a model. It is not the truth. People confuse a model for the truth all the time. It's not. It's like a chemical structure is not what the thing thing is. It's a representation of that thing that enables us to get some functional understanding of it. It is not the thing. The map is not the territory. So that's why I'm always emphasizing that. It's not that I'm down on that model. It's just that it's a model. Anyway, point is that understanding of it would say that this is something that was an empirical discovery. Like the original theory is that maybe humans picked the cacao pods for the fruit initially, like same as the squirrels do. Like the squirrels eat them off the trees and eat the fruit, whatever. Sure. So maybe people were harvesting it for the fruit, and then maybe they just piled up some of the seeds, and the seeds fermented, and somebody like, oh, this is interesting. And one day somebody toasted them, and then they, you know, it could have been something that was elaborated over centuries by sort of trial and error and whatever. That's the standard model. So this could be something that took a few hundred years for people to develop that technology. The other more sort of left of center model or left field is the shamanic model, which is that, you know, somebody might have had a dream one day, like the plant told them, like, you know, that they're like, they had a little visit from the cacao spirit. The cacao spirit said, prepare me this way. You know, yeah. And there are crazier things, you know, there are crazier hypotheses than that, I think, because even in terms of like modern scientific discovery, you have the technical and empirical knowledge, and then just about every major discovery. I mean, just taking medicine, leaving aside the invention of electricity and all the other things, just medicine like penicillin, it's always a mixture of like this empirical process of trial and error and learning. But the thing that creates the jump is this intuitive thing, an event or some happenstance and a combination of like an insight. So like the classic thing of Alexander Fleming and his penicillin thing, and like he was growing these molds, or what he was growing the bacteria, and a spore landed on it, and he noticed one day that it had killed a load of the bacteria, and he was like, oh. And then he just got, I think Fleming actually nicked the idea from someone else, so that story may be a bit apocryphal. But anyway, the point still stands. The point still stands that, you know, you've got kind of every major invention, well, let's not say almost every major invention is always a mix of a sort of background, a substrate of practical experience, knowledge, and some kind of X factor of inspiration comes in. So I think it's likely actually not to be an either or situation. I think it's probably both, you know, like humans started eating the fruit because they saw the squirrels were eating the fruit. And then at some point somebody got this idea, the plant spoke to them or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think about bread, like the download to mix this and this and this and this and this and this. And like, cool, we're going to make bread.
Yeah, exactly. Same diff, right? And it's kind of, it's crazy, but like all these processes involving fermentation, and particularly some of the processes that have been evolved in indigenous cuisines, you're just like, what the hell, you know? And the combinations of plants in traditional medicines, like how did they know to put this plant with that plant to produce this effect? Because if it was purely empirical, then a lot of people would have died to find that out. Do you know what I mean? Like,
right. Totally.
Just mix that with that and see what happens. No, there's got to be some kind of, it's a combo, isn't it? It's like evolution and inspiration. There's always that thing. Yeah, I think.
So I want to talk about milpas. And this was really fascinating reading about your books. You know, I spent some time in the Nobe Indigenous, which is one of the 7 indigenous tribes of Panama, and farming and connecting with the land and connecting with these people. Like, I feel like one day I'm just like going to be a farmer. Like, I just see like that being like my ultimate destiny, like my ultimate purpose in a way. And I've had a little bit of experience learning from permaculture, and it kind of seems like milpa is like the original, even before permaculture, this word permaculture kind of got developed.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I mean, I'm not a historian, so you'd want, I mean, obviously I did some history for the book, right? Because that was the background to it. So I don't know about the world development of agriculture in the world per se, but certainly in Mesoamerica, that the milpas seem to be very, very old. So just for anyone who doesn't know, that word, it's actually a Spanish colonial word for the way that the Mesoamerican indigenous population grew food, and still do today, where it's distinct from the European style of monocropping, right? Where you just plant a field of wheat or a field of whatever. In Milpa, it actually is companion planting, basically, where you plant your maize with this other plant that will fix nitrogen in the soil, some sort of beanie plant, some leguminosae plant, and then you plant it with chilies and squash. So you've got the sort of classic combo of something like cacao, which will be a shade tree to other little things. And then you have another tree that's a shade tree to the cacao. And then it turns out when you investigate these little mini plantations scientifically, you find that, like, as I say, the beans fix nitrogen in the soil, and then you've got other plants that will encourage the growth of certain fungi in the soil that will benefit the other plant. And all this is like very known about in traditional sort of like in organic gardening circles nowadays, where you have companion planting, like you plant this plant next to those plants because it will keep the pests off them. You know, it's just that it would be something that's empirically arrived at.
It's like a synchronicity or like a synergy.
Yeah, synergy is a great word for it, you know, because where the whole adds up more to more than the sum of its parts. Exactly, synergy is a great word. So I mean, what's fascinating is some of those milpas have been in continuous cultivation for thousands of years. They've never had to stop growing stuff in them because the soil is exhausted, because the balance of the plants in the soil is so good that they just keep going. So it is, as you say, the original permaculture. And obviously permaculture is a brilliant sort of movement that emerged in the mid sort of 20th century, sort of after 50s, 60s, 60s, I think, onwards. I don't know a lot about the modern history of permaculture, as a response to the sort of monocropping and the, you know, I think it was Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring in the 1960s, which first flagged up the potential for ecological devastation that we were reaping with this monocropping model, you know, just spraying loads of pesticides and herbicides and whatever and all that, and that we find replicated in medicine and in society, you know, that all of this I see as the result of a materialist philosophy, a philosophy of materialism, which is the to put it crudely, the matter before mind theory. You know, so like every traditional culture always assumed in their models of the universe that we are living in a mind before matter universe of some sort. Like at first there was some sort of deity, God, spirit thing, and then things, you know, so there was some sort of mind before matter model. So the materialist model is a matter before mind model. Now, does that necessarily have to end up with an exploitative relationship with things? Does that model necessarily mean that we have to interact with things in a way which just objectifies everything, literally? No, I don't think it does, but it does certainly lend itself to it far more than any of the traditional religious beliefs or mind before matter universe beliefs. Because if you think that everything comes from spirit, from God, everything has a sort of there's a certain sacredness to life or to the world, where, you know, in a shamanic sense, everything has its own sort of spirit or animating property, everything that's not mass manufactured and identical. But then even in a later religious sense, even in the sense of the monotheistic religions like Christianity and Judaism and Islam and all that, we are still humans are regarded as custodians of the planet. So while animals may not have souls in those religions, they are still from God and we have to look after them, yada, yada, yada. So none of this is an argument for or against a religious perspective. It's just an observation. It's not an observation that I've made. It's an observation that many people have made. And as I say, I wanted to sort of put that in the book because that's, you know, it's relevant to now, to what we're doing. Yeah.
You know, on the religious part, you know, when I was with the Nobe indigenous people, I found out that the Nobe people would use cacao ceremonies to help heal the sick and to get rid of evil spirits within the community.
Oh, amazing.
And to me, it's like, okay, this community, this society, okay, when they see someone sick, they come together as a community and they say it's time to heal the community. It's not so that person that's, say, sick or ill, it's a reflection of the society. And I've been really considering this, you know, coming from the US. I spent most of my life in California. It's like, man, I would just look at these homeless people living in Los Angeles on the streets and be like, man, it's like they're fucked up, they're messed up. But I didn't really have the knowledge, or say the wisdom, or the information to be like, maybe this is because of the society that we live in that's causing, say, these mental health issues, this and that. And where is the connection? Where is the community to help support this and bring the ecosystem of the society to harmony and to alignment?
Exactly. I think that's so interesting and really spot on. And at some point, Andrew, I'd love to interview you about your experiences with the Nobe people. Did you say where are they in Central? Are they in Mesoamerica, Central America?
They're in Panama, Costa Rica.
Okay, because what I'd love to chat to you about that for the second edition, because that's fascinating and that certainly tallies. So I'll get onto that in a second. But just to your larger point about the sort of homeless people and the ecosystem and that, and I think traditional societies, particularly those with shamanic, and I make a sort of artificial distinction in the third section of the book about sort of metaphysics of cacao between what I call immersive and external magical technologies. So an immersive one would be something like shamanic, where a ritual where you actually change your consciousness and you enter another dimension, or you commune directly. There's a direct experiential lived experience type thing, experience of the spiritual or whatever. And then an external technology would be something like a divinatory technology, like whether that be, you know, in the West, it could be something, well, in all cultures, it's some version of astrology, but you could also be looking at any form of external thing where you're not immersed, you're not participating in it, but you're doing that sort of externally. Oh, I can't remember where I was going with that. I had a point, but it's just fallen out of my head. There was a point to me mentioning the two different technologies. We were talking about the ecosystem, and I think just maybe go on. Sorry.
Yeah. So society, Nobe people using cacao ceremonies to help heal the sick, to get rid of evil spirits within the community.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. I think it. The point of me bringing that up was just that we've developed to, it sort of went from immersive in terms of social evolution. This is my cereal box version of it. We went from immersive to external to kind of nothing at all in terms of spiritual, at least in terms of our conceptualization of it in the West. And I think that civilizing process, or evolution away from a sense of being part of nature to being separate from it, has accompanied, and this is really, I think lots of people are speaking about this now, which is amazing. I think we're waking up as a species to this realization that what we've lost is a sense of unity, and we've always known that as humans. Like, I think that's the biblical Garden of Eden myth, isn't it? That's the similar myth of the golden age in human history. But I think we're aggravating that separation with every step into materialist thinking that we take. So to the extent now where you can buy meat packaged in a supermarket, if you think about how insane and psychopathic that is for a moment, I mean, I'm not talking about whether or not you should eat meat. That's a separate issue. It's like that traditional societies all ate meat, but they would have their cow, their pig, and they would kill it, and they would say a prayer, and they would give thanks, and they would recognize that that was an animal and a life they've just taken, and that animal was going to feed them, and then they'd have a dump, and then they'd feed their fruit trees with the poo, and it was all a big cycle. You know, you're part of a large system, and all of that system, everything is interconnected. Because we've kind of just thrown out anything that's non-materially linked. Like, we can't see a material A to B physical cause link. Anything that is not proximate, A to B to C, we've thrown it out for the last 100 years in the West as like, this is not relevant. as a direct result of that, I think we're now experiencing more and more sort of psychological fragmentation, but at the same time as our technology is getting more and more crazy accelerated. So that's really interesting. So the cacao thing, where cacao comes into that, I think, and why there's such a proliferation of cacao ceremonies, is because I do think it's one of those plants that, as again, to put it in my little hypothetical lingo, as a hedonic modifier, it modifies pleasure responses, and I think it's also slightly anti-phobic. I suspect it dials down conditioned fear. Those would be my two little farmer jargon ways of putting what I think cacao does in a nutshell. But in Mesoamerica, my hypothesis, and this is really based on the work of sort of Dryce and Greenhill and Cameron McNeil's book, and like lots of other people, so I'm building on the back of lots of other people's work here, but my hypothesis is that the cacao was used as a kind of portal opener. It was used in ceremonies to enable easier access to the ancestors and to the spirit world. And that may be because partly it facilitates the action of entheogens like mushrooms, which I think it does. It just boosts them, gives them a little level up, like I say, by about 25%, probably because the monoamine oxidase inhibitors in it and yada, yada, yada. But also partly because, as I think you've already mentioned, Andrew, like your experience with the breath work, just cacao on its own makes you more open. It changes your consciousness, or let's put it a different way, it enables you to change your consciousness more easily. I think that's the truth of it. So I think it's like it's not like a psychedelic, like, you know, drinking ayahuasca, where it projects you into outer space. It catapults you into that other dimension straight away. It sort of oils the hinges on the door. Do you know what I mean? It kind of, it just makes it easier to open those doors. And I think that's what it does. And I know from one of Cameron McNeil's bit of research into curanderismo in Central America nowadays, they use cacao to attract good. So it's really interesting what you say about your time with the Nobe, that they use it in a similar way to facilitate good. And it's so interesting how the pharmacological stuff and the sociological studies and the mythology and it stacks up and is all pointing in a similar direction. And I think that's why cacao ceremonies and cacao itself is becoming more and more popular, because even on the level of commercial chocolate, we've been trying to self-medicate for ages, you know? But
yeah, you know, it's interesting. I want to bring up, because we're on this topic about connection, you know, I'm sure I know, reading your book, I know you said you've traveled to Guatemala. And for me, like traveling to different places, like living in Hawaii, now Thailand, traveling Central America, around the world, you know, I found like I realized what the big pandemic, like true pandemic like what I'm seeing is disconnection from myself, disconnection to my feelings, my emotions, disconnections to others, disconnection to the earth, disconnection to the divine. And I'm just like figuring out, and like what and what I'm hearing from you and reading the book and even diving in, it's like how important it is to be connected. And how am I being connected? Number one, with myself. How am I connecting with other people? How am I connecting with the earth? And how am I connecting to the divine? And so this is what I really find doing these cacao ceremonies. It helps bring that together. And just a reminder for everyone and anyone who comes is like, guys, this is a reminder that we can do this every day. It's not that we even need the cacao to stay connected to ourselves. We don't need the cacao to connect with others. We don't need the cacao to connect to the earth or to the divine, but it's a remembrance.
Yeah. 100%. That's a great way of putting it, Andrew. I love that. I think as with all plant medicines, cacao, as you say, is a facilitator. It shouldn't be mistaken for the message. You know, it's the messenger. It shouldn't be mistaken for the message. And I think what cacao does is it helps us reconnect that, and it can certainly medicate out some degree of our existential malaise, but really it's facilitating that connection. And I think that is 100% what we're, maybe not 100%, but a large amount of what we're missing. so I mean, what I think society needs in a way, how this would look, I have no idea, but everything needs to move towards some sort of permaculture model, like
Yeah.
our economic, our social systems, everything. If there's that there needs to be, and you can, I think in terms of, just to simplify it, because I think you can get really, oh, how this is such a huge job, our society is so messed up, blah blah blah. Actually, it's such an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think, well, let me complete thought number one before I move on to thought number two. Thought number one was, when I'm treating people as a herbalist, I'll often suggest a really simple intervention, like what can this person actually do on a daily basis just to improve things. And I think you can intervene on almost any level, mental, physical, emotional, whatever, but I usually do a practical thing. So just by, for example, getting people to compost more, just by getting people to use recyclable carrier bags, just by all of these things, these simple interventions are starting to change the way we're doing things. Just by getting people to meditate more on the mental, emotional level, that also will. So all of these things are happening. So I don't feel despair about this. I think just by building those things in, the model is already changing, because these things change consciousness. They do. And it's obviously, with the whole crazy situation in the world at the moment, where people are being sort of encouraged to isolate more, shall we say, by circumstances, I think I think in the end it will actually have, I hope that I'm right about this, in the end it will have the opposite effect. It'll make people realize how disconnected we have already been. And I think I've seen that already. You know, when I went into lockdown, my first thought was like, oh my God, this doesn't feel that different from my daily life. And that was like, and I was like, there's something really wrong with this picture. Do you know what I mean? I was so actually, I think that's a real positive. And I think loads of people are in that position. Do you know what I mean? It's like, oh, I already work. I already don't see that many people. And it's like, okay, this is a problem. So there's that. And I think that was thought number one. And then thought, no, I've got to be able to write my thoughts down, because otherwise it's like I've lost a tangent, but it'll come back later on. But yeah, I think that was where I was going. I was just at a retreat this weekend where it was exactly what you described. It was just a whole bunch of people in the middle of Wales countryside. I went swimming in a lake every morning. We hung out every day. We had a little sort of sharing circle every evening, which sometimes I can find painfully artificial, but in this case it was really good. Like, people were just being genuine and talking about their stuff in an uninhibited way, and it was fantastic. And it's just like, this is the medicine. This is the medicine we need. So yeah, cacao is just one of the facilitators of that, and it's a very gentle facilitator of that, I think. And really, I think it can lubricate any intention that you put to it, and that I think it's really an intention activated medicine. And I say that advisedly, because there's been a couple of little trials which I talk about in the middle of the book, which show that just eating ordinary chocolate, if you eat it just without thinking about it, it doesn't have any effect on mood. But if you eat it with intention or mindfully, it seriously elevates your mood. It reduces depression. And they compared it to like drinking water, apples and crackers. And unsurprisingly, the water and apples and crackers didn't have much of an effect on a mood. Chocolate did, but only when it was eaten mindfully. And I was like, well, there you go. I mean, these are very, very small trials just using ordinary eating chocolate. But I'm like, well, that's exactly what we're talking about here.
So this is beautiful. I love how we're just like riffing and it's just like flowing to the next thing. Because the next thing I want to talk about is like science and human innate knowing. Because like I told you before, like, you know, what I had, and correct me if you feel like I'm saying something incorrect or wrong or challenge anything. I'm open to being wrong. So from spending time with the Nobe people, you know, knowing and learning how they use cacao ceremonies to help heal the sick and to get rid of evil spirits, I'm like, okay, this has got to be some human innate knowing. Like, you somehow got inspiration or somehow you got some sort of knowledge, a dream or something that you knew this. And then now, thousands of years later, now with science and everything, it's coming out that cacao is a natural antidepressant. It's one of the most antioxidant-rich foods on the planet, which means it gets rid of free radicals, which means it may help cure cancer. And I'm interested on what you have to say about this.
Okay, just two little things on the science thing. I would say that I think that's really interesting, and so the innate knowing thing I'll come to second. First, I just want to. You said two things there. You said one was cure cancer. It might prevent or reduce the likelihood of cancer, and it would certainly be a useful adjunct in cancer. I don't think cacao is necessarily going to be a cancer cure. I don't think it's strong enough for that, but it will certainly most likely reduce the possibility of you getting many types of cancer. And as I talk about in parts of the book, it's a useful adjunct in some cancers. It seems to reduce the growth of certain types of cancer cells and encourage them. So I absolutely agree, but just that's my little bit of pedantry about, you know, being careful not to overstate the, you know, so
yes.
and yeah, you know where I'm coming from with that. And then
you're an herbalist, man. You're a professor. You're
right, exactly. and then there was a bit you said before. Antidepressant. I don't think cacao is an antidepressant exactly. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. So I think as I say, my little phrase is hedonic modifier, because it kind of like, it says that it lubricates the pleasure circuitry, but not that it's, so my analogy for that is like, say you've got a mixing desk, not a mixing deck, like a desk like you use in a studio to like mix music or whatever, you know.
Got it.
They like turn up the bass and, you know, do all that stuff. So like a pure stimulant like amphetamine would just turn up the volume, like bang, like whack up the volume. Another kind of stimulant that doesn't work in exactly the same way, like cocaine, would turn up the amplifier. So same effect, different mechanism, gets louder. Something like cacao, and I'm thinking in terms of the pleasure chemicals in the brain, right? And an antidepressant would probably do, lots of the antidepressants would probably do something similar, like be an amplifier, but in a less, in a more sort of like low grade and gradual, but like consistent way. Cacao, I think, actually changes the EQ. It doesn't change the volume. It doesn't change the amplification. It just enables you to pick out the bass a bit more, or just to pick out the hi-hats a bit more. It changes the sound balance to make everything clearer. Do you know what I mean? So
interesting.
The reason, there are several reasons I say that. One from a traditional thing, and I'll get onto the broader topic about the knowing about cacao in a sec, but I just wanted to address this while it came up, because it's an important thing, I think, because lots of people have said to me, oh, is cacao an antidepressant? And I'm like, well, it does seem to increase serotonin turnover in the brain, and obviously from the reductionist model, we like serotonin is supposed to be this sort of, you know, the thing that causes depression if it's low. It's not quite that simple, but that's part of it probably. Cacao, when it came to Europe, was classified as a melancholic substance in pre-modern Europe, which means it's cold and dry, and it's one of those substances which was seen to expel melancholy, but could also build it up if you had too much of it. And that's certainly my experience of cacao. If you have a ceremonial dose of cacao every day, you will note after a few days that it stops elevating your mood so much, and even after a while might start to make you feel a bit exhausted and kind of tired, and it's like you get neurotransmitter burnout a little bit,
because it taxes on the adrenals, right?
Well, maybe. I mean, but I'm not sure actually, because it might do, Andrew. Yeah, that's one.
I got to be careful, because if I sidetrack you too much, I don't want you to lose your original.
I won't. Don't worry. I've got that on a hanger. That's on a peg. Cool. So yeah, no, the adrenals thing is a good way of conceptualizing it, but it may not be accurate. Do you know what I mean? So the thing is, because I've done a science degree, it's the most hippie science degree you can possibly do, like BSc herbal medicine. I mean, hello, but like it's like fully yogurt weaving, right? But I mean that because I've done that degree, I'm very aware of how opponents of complementary medicine, or people who are very, very scientific in their thinking, like precision and will discount a theory or a thought if it is technically inaccurate, no matter whether or not it may be functionally or empirically somewhat true. So that's why I'm sometimes a bit pedantic about like, oh, we don't know that for sure, or that's not, because I think it's important to be clear so that we don't lose things in translation when we're communicating with people who like to, you know, see the numbers.
Understand.
You get me. So adrenal fatigue, yeah, I think functionally it's kind of something like that. Whether it is adrenal fatigue or whether it's the neurotransmitters in the brain depleting or something along those lines, I don't know. We know that from clinical trials of cacao, both acutely, like single dose, and over 2 weeks. Actually, this isn't cacao, it's dark chocolate, so made with cacao, significant potential cacao. We can be reasonably, like 99.9 recurring, sure that it is the cacao that's doing this. But in those trials, they found that it both acutely and over that 2 week period reduced levels of adrenaline and cortisol. So reduced stress steroid measured in saliva and urine of human volunteers. So that's a single dose of cacao will do that, and if eaten every day. So it reduced the level of adrenaline and cortisol. So in that way, it's stress reducing.
Yeah.
However, what we also know is people in a state of chronic stress, like chronic ongoing life stress, like somebody who's looking after a patient, like a parent with dementia, or who has a child who's terminally ill or something, some horrible situation where you can't get away from it, or you're just getting bullied at work, or whatever it is, you know, you're going through chronic stress. We know that if that continues long enough, then your level of cortisol also drops in that situation, because your adrenals, that is what you sort of colloquially call adrenal fatigue. It's just like, you know, the air's going out of the balloon. Your stress response can't keep up. So in terms of cacao, I think it definitely reduces the impact of stress. If you're going through a high stress period, so your adrenaline's up here and your cortisol's up here, then cacao acutely, or for even low dose for over a few days, can reduce your adrenaline and cortisol levels, and that's a good thing. If somebody's already freaking exhausted, it may not be exactly the right thing to do. And it is a stimulant, so it's going to slightly deplete those neurotransmitters. So it's a kind of, it's partly based on your constitution, what you get on with. Some people can take cacao more frequently than others. Myself, I find that 2 or 3 times a week max for me. I'll take a good, almost ceremonial dose, like 40 grams 3 times a week is what I'm taking, twice or 3 times a week. So I
in the
really
morning or evening?
Morning. Hell no, not in the evening.
Okay.
I want to sleep. No, so yeah, morning. But just so that, and I know that on those days my thinking, so I tend to do them on days when I don't have to interact with a lot of people, when I have lots of thinking to do, because it really helps my thought processes. It helps my thoughts flow a little bit more. So, you know, but that's just how I utilize it. And I suspect that there will probably come a day when I don't use cacao at all anymore, you know. Certainly not yet. I really enjoy it, but at some point in the future, because I think it is, for me, it's a very helpful medicine and ally, and I love it, and it tastes really good, and it's nutritious and great physically in terms of preventing or lowering the risk of heart disease and stroke and diabetes and lots of the major killers in the West. But I also think that I do rely on it as a little bit of a crutch emotionally. So therefore, at some point, you know, it's going to have to be.
I can relate.
You know? Yeah. I
this
mean,
this is me relating to you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's in terms of, I mean, one of my mottos, I swear I'm going to come back to the indigenous thinking thing in a second, because I've not forgotten it. It's on the peg. One of my little mottos is, try to make your vices your virtues, because I think as humans, we're do you know what I'm saying? It's like sometimes I put it colloquially as the methadone method, which is kind of a crappy phrase, because methadone is actually really bad for you and potentially even worse than heroin. But not that I'm suggesting anyone who's on methadone gives up and goes back to heroin, but you know what I'm saying? It's the analogy is, if you've got a vice or a bad habit, if you can, rather than trying to go cold turkey or just eliminate it, cut it out, you can fully Tony Robbins it. You can do that. You can power through and power up. But that requires a huge warmth of energy. And the thing about Tony Robbins is he does these retreats with people, with a community. He gets people together, and you outsource the energy from the whole community to power you up with those things. If it's just you on your Todd, you've only got yourself, and we are disconnected, then I think the best method is to swap your vice for something that is good for you, if you can. So if you know what I mean. So cacao is very that for me. It's like, it's something that I will use 2 or 3 times a week as a pleasurable pick-me-up, that I know also has fringe benefits in terms of reducing my risk of heart disease and stroke. Those are 2 major concerns for me, because there's lots of heart disease in my family. And it also helps my brain and helps my thinking. But I am also aware that it is a bit of a crutch. So at some point in the future, that's going to be something that, as hopefully, as my life evolves and I feel more connected and manage to sort of unpick and reweave some of the emotional programming that I've got, that may be something that falls by the wayside. And then all right, to go back to the indigenous thinking, like your question was basically, I'm paraphrasing, correct me if I'm wrong please Andrew, it was something along the lines of how did people come up with using cacao in this way? Was that what where you were going with that?
So it was an open thing about human innate knowing, and so I just trust that you're in tune with that.
Oh, well, maybe. I don't know, hopefully. But so human innate knowing, I mean, it's a big old thing. Obviously, I am fully a product of the modern 20th century West, and I'm kind of an academic-y person. I get on quite well with, I mean, not fully, there are times when it bores me as well, but I get on well with academics generally. So I describe myself as a herbalist, for example, as a top-down, and there are bottom-up herbalists. So bottom-up herbalists would be like people who've grown like the root from the roots, right? So their family were herbalists. They've grown up since they were little, knowing plants and eating plants and using plants and growing them from seed. I'm very not that. I'm not fully divorced from it, because my granddad was a great gardener. My mum was a great gardener. My granddad used to make herbal wines, and I helped him as a kid. So there's a little bit of that in my direct lived experience, but I'm very much top down. Like I used to say, I have brown thumbs. I can't grow anything. Now I can grow some stuff. I've got a little herb garden, but it's very much been like books and book knowledge first, and then and then doing it, and then the experience. So top down or bottom up. But I think it's just knowing where you're at. So if you know that you're operating from a very theoretical level, like you need to know the mechanisms and understandings of things, that's fine. That's a good starting point, and then get into the doing. Vice versa, if you're a doer and you kind of want to learn about the mechanisms, just start where you are and jump off. In terms of innate knowing, I think that is definitely a thing, and I think we make it, all of this head stuff makes it harder to get that innate knowing. I mean, if you speak to, I mean, I'm not a shaman. I'm not a trained shaman or anything like that. I'm a Western trained herbalist. So you'd need to speak to shamans and curanderos about this stuff, that particularly those in a shamanic tradition will communicate directly with the plant. And how do they do that? It's often through a dream. They'll maybe do a dieta where they won't eat anything. They'll fast for a few days, and then they'll spend time with the plant. They'll maybe eat it. They'll maybe drink it. They'll whatever. And then after a few days, they'll get a dream about the plant and communicate with it. And I have no reason not to believe that was, that was how things have been done for millennia. That's probably, you find a plant, you hang out with the plant, you fast a little bit, and then you see what comes to you. And at the same time, you'd probably be starting to experiment with, but you'd wait for what comes to you first, I believe. But I mean, and the reason I believe that, if you want a reason, because we are operating on a technological platform in the technological West, the reason for that would be that it's that seems to have a long historical root, that tradition. If you shamanism in the Amazon and cultures worldwide, they will all have, there's a commonality in terms of the practice of ingest, like doing that kind of thing, like getting information through dreams and through spending time with a plant in that way. So the fact that this is sort of like a global phenomenon which seems to be of ancient origin suggests to me that this has always had a role to play in the development of our relationship with plants. And the idea that plants are these, separate species with no mind, no consciousness, is purely a 20th century materialist thing. Not purely, actually. I mean, that's not fair, but because the monotheistic belief that animals and plants have no soul also plays into that. It's just, as I say, I see this stuff as a sort of an evolution or devolution, depending on which way you flip the script, away from this sort of shamanic origins, where we're closer to being immersed in experience of things, and we see ourselves as part of a ecosystem in the most direct lived experience way. Like you and the jaguar can, there's a jaguar spirit and plant spirits, and you're all sort of interacting with each other constantly, to the civilized thing where we start settling and we build these structures which separate ourselves from nature, and we develop more sort of, the gods that evolved were more separate from humanity. They were sky gods and up here and stuff like that. All this stuff is, it's been written about many times before. I mean, Nietzsche talked about it, and there's 20th century thinkers like Camille Paglia, who I know is very controversial, but whose books I absolutely love, talk about this kind of stuff. They're sort of the sort of evolution of thought and society up till where we are today. Although I have to say, even that way of thinking about things as some sort of linear evolution is an entirely Western model, because any traditional society, well, most, maybe not any, got to not be universalist about these things, but tend to think about history as a spiral, or as things that sort of, it's a bit like there's nothing new under the sun. There are only iterations of themes that kind of recycle in different ways that appear. So it never quite repeats. It's a spiral, not a circle. It's not like you're repeating the same history. It's like history is a spiral. So this Western idea of an evolution or a devolution, like a straight up climb or a straight down fall, is a very 20th century invention, much like our way of looking at plants as non-thinking beings. And I'd just like to point any listeners towards a really interesting book that came out a couple of years ago by Monica Gagliano, called Thus Spake the Plant. And it's a lot smaller and a lot cheaper than my book.
Will you say that again?
Yeah, Monica Gagliano. That's Gagliano. Monica Gagliano, and it's called Thus Spake the Plant, I think. And it's only a slim book. She's a sort of plant scientist from Italy, and she's also really into shamanism. So this book is fully hippie, like it's fully hippie, like when you read it. But she's also a scientist, and she invented these amazing experiments with sensitive plants, mimosa, Mimosa pudica, the one that you stroke and they fold up.
Okay.
Where she put them on little sort of in little platforms where they would be dropped. And of course, when the plant was shocked in that way, it closed all its fronds up. And she did this to plants in sort of high light conditions. So there's lots of energy and food available to them in the low light conditions. And she trained the plants to expect when to be dropped and whatever, and then switch things up and change the conditions. What she was able to show, the Cliff Notes version of these experiments, was she was able to show the plants remembered and learned what was going to be happening, and were to some extent able to predict when they should, because closing up their leaves takes a lot of energy. So she was like, according to modern science, this should not be possible, because the plant has no central nervous system. It has nothing in it that would enable it to record memories, and there's no physical mechanism being identified as to how this could happen. Now, she does say that this may not, of course, there may be some physical mechanism discovered in future, but this should not be possible with what we currently know. So, but as she says, if you go to a shamanic understanding of it, like that consciousness may not entirely reside in our bodies, that maybe our brains are just receptors for consciousness. Maybe our brains are just, they're not fully generating it, they're picking it up. this is apparatus for receiving and filtering, not just generating, then that's like, then, oh, that's interesting, you know. So it's so cool. I mean, it's a very little book, and I think I'm kind of in love with it. I'm not sure whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's just a what it is kind of thing, that she talks about a lot of her experiences going on dietas in the Amazon with different plants and all the dreams she's had, because I think that's lovely as a reader. But I think anyone who's really skeptical will immediately be switched off on reading that. But her experiments are so good. They're really rigorous, you know? So it's kind of like one of those, a little bit like Rupert Sheldrake's work, who's just this amazing scientist, but gets discounted a lot because he comes on stage with bare feet and talks about if there's consciousness in the sun, you know. It's just like, he's all his ideas are good, and I think one day these people will be proved 100% correct. That is my belief. But it's just that the man, you know, sometimes it's like the packaging is like, it puts some people off, but maybe we don't need to worry about those people.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant book, and just worth a little read, because her experiments are so they're just clever little experiments, very simple, but that show something's going on there that you can't explain.
Yeah. Who's that guy's name that you were saying, talking about the consciousness of the sun?
Oh, Rupert Sheldrake. He's I mean, if you haven't come across his work, he's amazing. His theory of morphic resonance, which is that it's his own theory, and it's really a scientific retelling of Platonic theory of Plato, who believed that, you know, the philosopher Plato was like, things exist in the nous, in the world soul, or whatever you want to call it, in the astral realm or whatever. Like, they exist in the imagination of God, or in spiritual form, before they exist in physical form. That's a sort of a condensation of some of Plato's ideas. But his idea of morphic resonance, his observation, and again, he's done tests to show that this is likely, is that everything with physical structures, new ideas, patterns in the world emerge as patterns. And then once that thing has taken shape, it replicates all over the world. So he did this with, he did a really simple physical example with a lead crystal. I think he grew a new shaped lead crystal in a laboratory, and then showed that in a laboratory on the other side of the world, with no physical connection between the two laboratories, that the same type of crystal grew much faster. And the third time it was grown in another laboratory, it grew even faster still. And that wasn't because of any change in the procedure or the environment or anything. His theory is that anything in the world, once it's taken shape, makes easier for others. So this is why, if you teach a rat in Australia something, he was again able to show this in a lab, in an experiment, that rats in England will learn that thing faster once the rats in Australia have learnt it. Now, you could say, oh, that's telepathy. He goes one step above that and says, no, this is a general universalizable principle that he calls morphic resonance, which is really a retelling of this old Platonic idea, in my view, that things exist in the general consciousness of the universe before they exist in physical space. And once you've created something in that consciousness, it can replicate in physical space. It's to my mind, but he's done it in a really scientific way. He's put together this sort of like this whole hypothesis called morphic resonance. It's the same idea, the same reason why I think if somebody has a genius idea, about two other people will have the idea at the same time in different parts of the world. And you could say, from a materialist skeptical standpoint, oh, that's just because humans have got to that point where those sorts of ideas are in the background anyway. But I'm like, well, maybe, but what he's demonstrating is that also seems to apply to physical structures and to behaviors, which is you know, like learned behavior, which is really amazing. So anyway, this is all massively off topic for Cacao, but I think interesting. So
yeah, it's what when you're talking about that, like the morphic resonance and how one rat can pick up, you know, another rat from England can also learn it quicker. It reminds me of like the electromagnetic field, like how there's, and I'm not sure if it's the electromagnetic field particularly, or it's just this other aura or this field, how we're kind of connected to things outside of this?
Who knows? I mean, it's a valid theory. I mean, what I like about his morphic resonance theory, though, is it's not materialist in that way. Magnetic fields, same as sort of gravity, you're still thinking about things in terms of mechanism, like levers and things pulling you, you know? What if there is no freaking mechanism? What if we are like I talk about this in the third section of the book in terms of models of consciousness, because this is the big question, isn't it? Really, what is consciousness? Are we living in a mind before matter universe, a matter before mind universe, or a mind equals matter universe? So the mind equals matter is the panpsychist model, where like matter and mind are the same thing. It's in the idea that consciousness is latent in all matter, and matter is constantly trying to arrange itself into forms that express consciousness, which is a crazy idea but really interesting. That's the panpsychist notion. Then you've got the mind before matter notion. You've got various models there. You've got the traditional substance dualist model. That was Descartes' version of, you know, that there's mind, there's body and soul, right? So that's like a traditional religious view, almost like where you've got physical stuff and you've got the soul that goes into that, lives inside that physical stuff. It's called a substance dualist model, and that's one of those mind before matter models. You've also got monist, which means everything is one thing models, and your two monist models, you've got physicalism, which is there's only physical stuff and consciousness is an illusion produced by the brain. But then you've got its mirror image opposite, which is idealism, which is all of this physical stuff is a hologram. There is only mind. That is all that there is. And this is all a giant hologram. And so, you know, that we don't know, because the thing, but what is curious and interesting to me is that, you know, I understand nothing about quantum physics. I'm not a physicist. Physics was my worst subject at school, and I gave it up as soon as possible. So I'm not qualified to talk on these things. But in terms of you know, the double slit experiment and the observations from that, that we all know from pop physics, that when you observe a subatomic particle, its behavior changes. So the fact that it is being observed changes the behavior. Now that the sort of physicists have used a get out of jail free card, not physicists, but a lot of materialists have used a get out of jail free card, saying, well, that's true on the on the micro, you know, on the microscopic level, the submicroscopic level, that's true, but the rules are different up here. And it's like on our level, and it's like, well, if it is true on that level, isn't that saying something pretty fundamental? If observing a particle causes it to behave completely differently, then doesn't that slightly break materialism just a little bit? I mean, so I think we're in a really interesting phase now where we've still got all of the amazing tech and science from the sort of last couple of 100 years of materialism. And we've still got that amazing tool of science, which is to construct tests that test how something does something else and what bit of it does that thing or does not do that thing. But I think what we're going to have to grapple with next is, it really fundamentally depends what kind of universe we're living in. Because if we're living in any form of mind before matter universe, or a mind equals matter universe, panpsychist universe, or like one of the idealist universe, or the substance dualist universe, or anything other than pure physicalism, we are living in a universe where you cannot design a completely objective experiment. Because if you design an experiment, you've automatically created, if you think about a mind before matter universe, you've created something which will affect the results that you get. Because if everything is connected in, you know, if we're basically living in a magical universe, then you've already queered the pitch. There's no such thing as an objective data set. Do you understand what I'm saying there? Because it's like, by simply creating, let's say you want to test whether something's true or not. By designing this artificial experiment, you've created a little mental world. You've already sort of created. So it's almost like you can't pull a lever without the lever pulling you back a little bit in anything other than a fully materialist universe. Does that mean that science is therefore invalidated if it turns out we are living inside a giant mind or everything is connected by consciousness in some way? No, it doesn't. It just means that there's a limitation built in, and we have to be mindful of that limitation. So I think one of the things that really disgusts me most, and I use that word properly, it really does disgust me, is when I read posts on Wikipedia or whatever saying they're just really snooty about old beliefs, like about old religions or stuff that I love, like astrology, which has no scientific proof and we know is really woo and out there and whatever. But I'm like, the monumental hubris of some people in assuming that their frame is the absolute truth. It's just like, I guarantee you that in 500 years' time, most of the things we now think are true will have been disproven because history tells us that.
Mm.
So it's just, I don't know, it really bugs me. It's kind of like, as humans, we should kind of be like, our attitude to historical truth should always be like, let's improve upon that, but let's not assume that it was all rubbish. It's like there's the sort of like the equal and opposite to the historical fallacy, right? Where, you know, it's like you just stick the word fallacy on the end of the word historical and assume that anything in the past is rubbish. It's like, no, some of that is going to be useful. Anyway, I'm getting on my hobby horse now. So I think you should ask another Cacao related question.
Okay, I will do that. And then I have other questions for you later then. So going back to Cacao, what I wanted to discuss with you, Marcos, is there's this ancient prophecy that I've heard, and maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but basically the prophecy says, you know, in a time, Cacao will come from the rainforest to bring humanity and nature into harmony.
Okay.
And I've heard that from multiple people, and also another a cacao enthusiast who works with co-ops and cacao farmers in Costa Rica. And I'm kind of really, when I hear this now, like I feel like what better time than right now if this prophecy was to come true. And if someone is feeling called to share cacao, say to their community, their friends, you know, the way that you share it through this book, the Secret Life of Chocolate, you know, what would you say to someone that is inspired to share cacao to their community, to their friends?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I'm slightly skeptical about that prophecy. I have to say, I haven't heard it, but I think I think its message is good. I mean, I don't know. That's not to say I don't know. I don't know. I've not heard that. I'd be interested to know where it comes from, just because I know that in Herbland there are often a lot of these sort of whispers that get passed along, and then it turns out to have been invented by some hippie dude from the 60s. Do you know what I mean? So it's just like, oh, it's this ancient prophecy. It's just like, is it though? Is it? But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not some truth in it. And I think, yeah, it doesn't invalidate it. It just means I question the source. So, but I think, generally speaking, cacao, we know that traditionally it was used, as you indicated, you know, and still is, as a force for attracting good, and for uniting communities. And it was always used in this sort of, seems to have always been used in important ceremonies and threshold events, particularly with communities. So I think it's a completely valid sentiment in that prophecy that you've expressed, that it's an agent that might help unite communities and bring people together and all of that stuff. And particularly, as I say, because I think it's slightly anti-phobic, it helps reduce conditioned fears, and it helps with intention, when intention is applied, to improve one's perspective or one's mood or one's outlook, I would say. So my advice to anyone who's wanting to share it would be, first of all, on a personal and procedural and technical level, don't just buy ready-made cacao. I mean, do that for sure, because, you know, otherwise but buy beans, buy cacao beans and make the drinks yourself from scratch. It's kind of like, you don't, I said this before, and I think I said it in another interview, but you don't have to, it's like bread. Everyone should make their own bread at least once. Doesn't mean you have to make your own bread all the freaking time, you know, but you should know what good bread is and should know how to make it. I mean, I'm reminding myself because it's been freaking ages since I made bread, and I need to like, get on there and make some good sourdough. But the point there is get the beans, buy the beans, and if you can, buy them direct from a farmer or from a farm in Central America. If you can get a contact who can link you up to a farmer, so you're buying it direct from the person, not via a corporation if possible, just because you want the farmer to take the money, because they've gone to the trouble of growing it. And if they can ship it to you themselves, that's ideal. That's what I try to do. It's a bit logistically tricky sometimes because they're like, oh, how do I ship this? And it's awkward getting the money to them and whatever, but at least that way I know that I'm getting good beans, and I know that the person who grew them is getting paid, you know. So those are the two concerns that I have, really. I want to make sure that the people who are actually putting the effort in are, you know. So yeah, get some beans and prepare them yourself. So toast the beans, grind the beans. It's a lot of work, but do it from scratch, and then you'll get a good understanding, you'll get a better understanding of what cacao is, the substances that you're working with. There's a good little, I think it might be on even Mex Grocer, you know, this standard website that just sells like Mexican food, like just basic like maseca, mass-produced white corn flour and stuff like that. But they produce like they sell equipment like Kamal presses and stuff like that. I think on there they've got a good little recipe for making drinking chocolate from beans. Like they give you instructions on how to do it, but you can certainly find instructions on, and obviously in my book there's an entire recipe section, so you know there's if you've got my book you can do it from there. But there's that would be my strong advice if you're working with cacao, to do it. This is a very forgiving, very friendly plant. Is it universally beneficial? No, because nothing is. I talk about that in the book. Nothing is a panacea. There's no such thing as apart from maybe breathing and breath work. Breath work is probably a panacea, right? That's something that you could legitimately apply. I mean, there's probably going to be some unfortunate kid out there who's allergic to oxygen or something, but I mean, in general, like there's breath work is the panacea, right? I mean, but I mean, it's true. There's always the exceptions to the rule, but I think with cacao, it's very benign and very forgiving, and people who are sensitive to it will usually know. You usually get, you know, the occasional person who's like, oh, I can't have cacao because I'm allergic to it, or it gives me migraines. Although I sometimes do challenge the migraine thing, because the migraine thing, as I talk about in the book, is actually, when they've tested this scientifically, they found that cacao is no more likely to generate a migraine than any other food. So a lot of that is maybe partly conditioned response, which doesn't make it any less real, but it just means that it may not be the substance to blame so much as the belief. Yeah, I mean, the belief is, once a belief is attached to something, it's very hard to shift it. So but generally speaking, start working with it, make your own drinks, and start sharing it with people. And you don't have to make a big elaborate ceremony out of it. Just sharing it with people is thing. But remember the thing about intention. Drinking it mindfully is important. So what I'd say is, whenever you're drinking cacao with any purpose to heal or help, advise the person just to spend a couple of minutes before they drink it thinking about how they'd like to feel, or how the drink will help them when they drink it. Do you know what I mean? Something like that. And if they're fully not hippie and they're just not going to listen and they're not going to do it anyway, tell them to just maybe meditate for 5 minutes after drinking it. You know?
Yeah.
Because even fully skeptical people will be open to that. And if you want to blind them with science, you can tell that it dilates blood vessels and improves blood flow to the brain and everywhere else, and also makes you feel a bit more relaxed. So it's really good for meditating on, all of which is true.
I think that's such a magical and powerful thing to just, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you to help cure my cancer, or I want you to help cure my depression. And with that intention, there's power with that.
Yeah, fully. I mean, you can do that with anything. You can do that with water, but something like cacao, which actually has some pharmacological properties to back it up, that's the way to do it. That's basically shamanism 101, or the Janet and John version of it. It's just like you get a thing that does that has a physical action, and you combine it with a ritual. And a ritual can be as simple as saying, I want this to do this thing. That's your ritual. And then there's your physical thing. Done. Doesn't have to be super elaborate.
So Marcos, our time has come, but I'm requesting if we can do 10 minutes because I want to talk about one more thing. And I also want to talk how people can also get a hold of you and everything else. The thing that I really want to talk about is cacao powder versus the full cacao. And and before you share, I just want to share my personal experience and my knowledge and what I've been told and what I've learned through my travels. So there was this time in Costa Rica where this cacao enthusiast, he was working with cooperatives. I was traveling with him throughout Costa Rica. He was introducing me to people, and he was doing something so fascinating that he was actually turning the full cacao fruit, even the outside, and mixing it all together, even with the pulp, with the beans, and making a cacao drink from that. And this was like revolution.
Were these mature cacao pods, Andrew? Were they fully grown, like solid, or little ones?
Good question. I'm not sure, but this was like revolutionary, because when I was doing my own process and my experience with cacao, and then I met this guy and saw what he was doing, I was like, I'm staying with you wherever you're going. Like, I need to and he showed me this operation, all his different houses, and I'm still in touch with him. And he's an amazing inventor, super intelligent, super amazing guy. And anyways, and we could talk more about that. But, he was telling me, this cacao powder, he was like, yeah, it can actually pull nutrients from your body. The cacao powder that I'm talking about, like after you extract cacao fat from it. Yeah. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. So then I went to the indigenous community, and they were extracting the fat, the cacao butter from the cacao. It was like boiling up in this pot, fresh fire. It looked like a magical cauldron, what was happening. And they were just skimming the top. And then the byproduct, it would go bad within like 2 to 4 days. And you could eat it like right there, but it would go bad. And I just saw how these indigenous people just watched it go bad. So then I was like, maybe there's something to this. So I wanted to know if you had any feedback and any insight on this particularly.
Yeah, I've got some. That's really interesting. That the guy making the cacao pod, the reason I asked that question about whether he was using the whole adult pod or the immature pods was because when I was in Guatemala, in San Antonio, Suchitecapeth on the west coast, I heard tell of an atole, traditional maize-based drink called atole de pozunque. Was it atole de pozunque or atole de ceniza? Atole of ash. I can't remember. There were two names, and I think it was de pozunque, but I might be wrong, because the thing is, in different regions they change the names of the flicking atoles anyway, so it's difficult to. The point about this was, when I heard it described in 2011, the first time I was there, 2011, the lady said, oh yeah, they make it with the immature whole cacao pod, like the young cacao pods. They grind the whole pods up. And I was like, what, really? I was like, who makes this? And I was like, oh, she's like, it's called atole de ceniza, atole of ash. You can find it somewhere. When I went back in 2018, I found a lady at the market on a day when it was really loud. There was a freaking mariachi band standing right there playing while I was trying to interview her. So I had like my little recorder on, and all I could hear was, I was like, oh my God. Anyway, it's like, could this be any more challenging? So, and she was also like, no, this isn't my stall. My friend's just gone. She's coming back. And I was just like, I'm sorry, I have to go in an hour. So can I just interview you about it? But what she was selling, something called Atole de Ceniza, and it turned out just to be made with patashle, which patlaste or patashle, which is cacao blanco or Theobroma bicolor seeds. So it wasn't with these young, but I am sure, because that first time I went, that the ladies were talking about an atole that was made with the young, immature, whole cacao pods. Now we know that the fruit pulp also contains caffeine and theobromine, and so the fact that now you tell me there's some guy somewhere in, you say it was Costa Rica, making out of the whole pods, that just makes me even more, you know, because this was something that was like a little, you know, one little stray thread that I was like, I have to find this thing because I know that it exists somewhere. I just have this gut feeling. But of course, when I went back and looked for it, the atole that she was selling was something different. So anyway, I had to mention that because that was like really big. In terms of the cocoa butter extraction method you're mentioning, I know that there are two main methods that were traditionally used. The one method was the small volume method, where they would whip cacao in water manually, and if the ambient temperature was high enough, like over 30 degrees, which often it is in Honduras and Costa Rica and whatever, then the cocoa butter would eventually separate on the surface of the water. The second method, which is the large volume method, which is the one you're describing, which I also observed, was where they boil it in water and then they skim it all off the top, and then they leave it in a little jicara. They put it in a little bucket of water to cool, don't they? And it all separates off. The phenomenon you're describing is probably because that cocoa butter is somewhat impure. It's not refined as it would be in a factory. And without the sort of flavonols, the polyphenols in the whole cacao, you'll get some oxidation. So it'll degrade, it'll go bad, it'll rancidify as you describe. If the cocoa butter is relatively purified, if it's just got the sort of saturated fats in it, then it should stay white and not go off. But to bring it back to the cacao powder, I do not recommend the use of the powdered cacao. I'm not sure that your guy was right about it leaching stuff from the body. It may be a bit like, this may be one of those adrenal fatigue things where it's pointing to a truth but may not be exactly true. Do you know what I mean? I'm thinking it's probably something, I don't know. I mean, it may turn out that he's exactly right, but it seems less likely to me than that. What probably is going on is when you make the powder, you've removed a lot of the fat. And we know that the fat actually reduces oxidation in the polyphenols. So there's so many tangents from this, but the polyphenols, obviously the main antioxidant constituents in cacao. As I talk about in the book, antioxidants aren't everything. It's like they're a large part of the mechanism of cacao. The polyphenols are really important, but there are other trace constituents also produced during toasting, which reduces the amount of polyphenols. So, but polyphenols are an important group of constituents in terms of contributing to the effects of the cacao, in terms of health, and in terms of, because they're the main constituents that are being currently researched in terms of health benefits, and in terms of psychoactivity as well, I think, because they're monoamine oxidase inhibitory and because they increase nitric oxide release and stuff like that. So when you remove the fat, as in most of the powders, what they found is that the polyphenols oxidize much more quickly. They react with air, and the fat is actually protecting those polyphenols from air. So obviously most of these products with, so most of these products with that's just one group of constituents. In general, as with most plant medicines, it's better to use the whole damn thing, or the form in which it was traditionally made, because sometimes using maybe the whole raw food is poisonous, so they process it in a certain way. With cacao, it was traditionally fermented to some degree or other. Now, I suspect that it may have been fermented more towards the cacao lavado direction, which means just for a day or so, rather than the 5 or whatever days that are currently used, where it's really fermented. There may also have been regional variation, but the reason I suspect it was probably more towards the cacao lavado direction is because in Mexico, there are 2 different types of cacao. There's fermentado, which is fermented for like 4 or 5 days. And then there's a separate type called cacao lavado, which is only fermented for 1 day. But in the highlands of Guatemala, you can only buy one type of cacao, and they just call it cacao. And I was like, how long is that fermented for? And they're like, 1 day. So I'm like, oh, okay. So in this region, I have a feeling that cacao was traditionally just piled up and for a day or whatever, and then it was processed. So slightly fermented, and that fermentation process creates some acids and makes some vinegary taste and whatever, breaks down some of the polyphenols, but also produces some of the phenethylamine and serotonin and these little trace fairy dust constituents that I think on their own individually aren't enough to do anything, but when they're combined with all the other bits in cacao, just do little things where they're tickling your brain in lots of little background ways. So to bring it back to the cacao powder thing, I think what they've done in removing the fat is likely to increase the oxidation and reduce the quality of it. And I also suspect that having the fat there, even if the fat might be inert, it might not do a lot itself, it will change the pharmacokinetics. Again, this is materialist science, but what that means is the way in which a drug is absorbed. This is fundamentally important. We all know, and I use the analogy of cocaine in the books, it makes the point in the punchiest way, that chewing a coca leaf is different from snorting a line of cocaine, is different from smoking crack, is different from shooting up. Do you know what I mean? All of those things have escalating levels. Now, the whole leaf, in terms of coca leaf, for example, has all these other plant chemicals in it that make it a lot more benign, but it's also absorbed a lot more. Cocaine itself is absorbed a lot more slowly in the mouth. When you start smoke, you know, when you snort it, it's faster. Then when you shoot it up, it's faster. And also you strip out bits, you know, that change the effects. So with a whole plant like cacao, although the fat by itself may not do anything, we know that fat, for example, slows down stomach emptying. It retards the rate at which the stomach empties. And we also know that physically in the cacao bean itself, or in cocoa liquor, ground up cacao beans, it protects the polyphenols from oxidation. So the fat is kind of what might be described in modern pharmaceutical terms as a drug delivery system. You remove the fat and you've changed the way that drug will interact in your body. Or with your body, let's say. So it probably won't affect the levels of caffeine and theobromine in cacao, but it will certainly affect the levels of polyphenols, and it will certainly affect the way that the substance is absorbed. And in my experience, I don't know whether this is the same as yours, Andrew, but certainly for me, the most effective cacao is that which has been sort of like made from fresh beans and ground on the metate and then prepared freshly. I mean, it's just, there's no comparison to my mind.
Yeah. Well, man, yeah, that brings me back when I was in Panama, just with a rock on a rock.
Yeah.
And just doing that.
Yeah, it's hard work. It's hard work. It's a workout. And you look at these senoras over there who've like been doing it their whole lifetime, and they're just like, they're laughing at the gringo or the Espanol.
Yeah, totally.
Trying to do this. You totally can't grind it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Marcos, I want to thank you so much for taking the time with me and just to riff and to laugh and to talk about one of the things that is changing so many people's lives in a positive way. And just thank you so much for sharing your insights and sharing yourself with me and all the people who are watching this. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been really good fun, and you've asked some really good questions that, yeah, it's just been a pleasure talking to you. So thank you. Oh, and should I say website and stuff?
Do it.
Contact. Okay, so book website, thesecretLifeofchocolate.com. That's just info and gallery and all that kind of stuff. I think you've, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, that's the book, The Secret Life of Chocolate. Andrew's holding up there.
You see how thick this thing is?
Yes, once you've read it, you could use it as a doorstop or as some kind of, like, I don't know, like ladies finishing school training mechanism for getting your posture right or something.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it is like, I mean, I wanted it to be a proper reference work. So as is the nature of these things, that since it's been published, there's all these little things. I'm like, oh, I really want to add that or change that, or, you know, so that eventually there may be a second edition, but yeah, not for a while. So yeah, the website, thesecretlifeofchocolate.com. My practice website as a herbalist is nocturnalherbalist.com. And I've also got a YouTube channel. It's a very small YouTube channel with just me talking about herbs and cacao and stuff that I'm interested in, like astrology and also scientific testing of stuff. And that's called Nocturnal Herbalist as well. And then I think, Andrew, I'll send you the links for where people can get the book, because you can find it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. But if you don't want to line Jeff Bezos's pockets or whatever, then you can just go straight to the publisher. And there's a discount code from the publisher's website, which is CHOC20, CHOC 20, and CHOC's all in capitals, CHOC20, and that gets you 20% off. So yeah.
Marcos, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful, and we'll be in touch, and looking forward to the next part 2 of our conversation.
Awesome. I'll look forward to it as well. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, pleasure, man.
Right.
Talk soon.
Bye.